Welcome back, everyone. I'm the Bad Luck Gamer, and we're back after my vacation to Norway. It's been a little rough. We came back from Norway, and then it's in the middle of a heat wave, so this video is coming out a little bit later than I was hoping it would, but, it is what it is, and honestly, it's really hard after taking a long flight. Our flight was 17 hours, so, the jet lag and all that, whatever. Anyway, we're back, and this week we're going to actually be having two class builds, so keep a lookout for the other one that should be coming either tomorrow or the next day from when you see this video, probably, or when this video comes out. Not from when you see the video, obviously. And, yeah, also, because I couldn't get all the videos that I wanted out, we had some videos that didn't perform as well, and so the channel is kind of suffering from the algorithm a little bit. So if you could all do me a favor and like the video or subscribe or comment or whatever, it'd really help out. The Discord's also been popping off lately, and I'd also, we're also going to be doing some more stuff now that I'm back. So if you want to check that out, you can check it down in the description below, or if you want something less committal, you can follow me on Twitter. Anyway, all that out of the way, I actually had some really fun builds this week, and starting out, this build was harder than expected, but not too difficult. Once I got sat down and actually started writing it out, it actually came up really nice. But today we're going to be doing a Sorcerer build, and this build I've named the Eldritch Touch. So the Eldritch Touch Sorcerer is an Abberant Bloodline Sorcerer that really delves into what it means to come from the lineage of the old gods. You are a character who is primarily focused on attacking the body and mind of your foes. This build has a lot of good control to it, a lot of debilitation, also has a lot of good ways to just completely melt foes. It is a little squishy, so I do recommend playing a little defensively early in the early levels. But once you kind of get it down, and once you can kind of figure out what weaknesses your foes have, there's a lot that this build can do, and it's very thematic as well. As essentially, you can even skin this as you're not actually like a normal sorcerer, but an occultist who has tapped into the power of the old gods and is being irreparably changed throughout the course of your adventure. It's a really good build. And so let's go ahead and get started with what I would recommend for the stats for this class. Primarily, you're going to want to focus on your charisma. And then next, you're going to want to focus on your con. These are very important. Obviously, charisma is where all your spell DCs come from, all your spell attacks, your primary caster class. It's going to be very important that your charisma is very high for this build. And not only that, but we're going to be playing around with intimidation and demoralizing as well, making your stuff even more efficient when an enemy is properly frightened of you, as they should be. Con, obviously, is because Sorcerer doesn't get a lot of health, 6+ con modifier per level, means that you're going to be awfully squishy. And even though this build does come with some good ways to help prevent being damaged or to regain health, you're going to want as much health as possible to be a buffer to help you last as long as you can in a fight if things go sour. The last thing I'm going to recommend is going to be Wisdom. Wisdom is really good. It's a stat that I feel like a lot of people don't necessarily see the benefit of, but if you're not really focused on like recall knowledge checks, you want to be focusing on Wisdom for your builds because they give you more to your perception score, which is higher initiative. And there's a lot of ways you can kind of get around this. Obviously, if you're sneaking before combat, you can use stealth instead. But perception is the default way. And the sooner you go in combat, the sooner you can position yourself or set yourself up so that you do not get rocked immediately. So one of the general feats, I guess I'll mention as well, is Incredible Initiative. It's really important. You should probably pick it up as soon as you can, like level 3, as it's going to be very important for you. Alright, so there's going to be two skills predominantly that we're going to pick up, and mostly it's just for flavor, but obviously Intimidation is a very powerful skill. You can use it for demoralizing targets, and Demoralize is going to be really good because it reduces all checks and DCs a target makes at least until the end of their next turn. Unless you crit them, then they have a -2, and then it gets reduced down to Frightened 1, which gives them a -1. Either way, Demoralize is really, really good, and if you have the range, you can sit there, demoralize the target, and then use one of your spells on them. They're going to be a lot easier for you to affect with your spells. And this class is very predominantly focused on saves against enemies, so you're going to want the ability to kind of suss out what abilities they have. Use your lower level slots to poke at the enemy's weaknesses, see what they got, and then use your higher level slots to finish them off. That's kind of the way this build is going to go for a lot of things as well. The other skill I'm going to recommend is actually Occultism, as it adds a lot of good flavor to it. It gives you a lot of good, interesting skill feats you can pick up that really gives that cultist kind of vibe, the Eldritch kind of vibe, and it makes you an expert at aberrants and aberrations and all things not of the norm of, I guess, a fantasy world, which is a strange concept, but you know what I mean. And they got some good things as well. We'll get into the skill feats I recommend in a little bit, but next we're going to actually go into the Bloodline itself. All right, so why did I pick Abberant for the Bloodline for this build? And it's honestly quite easy. One, it's a very fun thematic build that they've released a lot of stuff for recently, like Dark Archive, which added some really cool things, some may which have been included in this build. But not only that, it gives a very interesting ability. Tentacular Limbs is a focus spell that you pick up, and when you use it for a single action for the next minute, you have a range of 10 feet for your melee strikes or your touch spells. And let me check real quick here. I believe it just gives you a range of 10 feet. I don't think it extends your range during that time. Let's see. Yeah, it just, your touch range spells and making unarmed strikes with your arms is 10 feet. So it doesn't, if you have a weapon, you can't use the weapon. It has to be an unarmed strike, which we'll get to that in the Ancestry section because I found some interesting kind of cool things to work into it. And then you can spend an additional action when you're using a touch spell to, is it a touch spell? Spell casting to extend your reach to 20 feet. And then every odd spell level after this, or every 4 levels, so, spell levels 1, 3, or 3, 5, 7, or whatever, or actual levels of, 5, 9, whatever. The additional amount that you can do extends by another 10 feet, which means I believe eventually you get up to like a 60-foot touch for some of your spells, which is pretty cool, honestly. And one of the interesting things about this is that the Abberant Bloodline gives you quite a few touch spells, one of which is Spider Sting, which is going to be really good for this build because Spider Sting is a very unique spell in the fact that it automatically does damage without the need to make a check or make the enemy fail. The only thing about Spider Sting that really is dependent on the save that the spell mentions is the additional poison damage and or the effects of the spider poison that it can do, which can enfeeble your foes. This is a really good spell early game, and when mixed with Tentacular Limbs, you're able to reliably do 2d4 damage, which is really, really good because enemies might even be likely to succeed, but may not be likely to crit succeed, even if they have a good fortitude. So you're likely to do at minimum 2d4 damage every time you cast a spell with no major drawbacks. And even if they crit succeed, they still take a d4 damage, meaning that the spell is never really wasted. And not only that, but if they actually fail the check, they get succumb to the spider venom, which does enfeeble them. I'll pull it up here real quick. The spider venom is a d4 damage when they fail the check and they become enfeebled 1, and then another d4 damage and they become enfeebled 2. And this lasts for a maximum of 4 rounds. So if they keep failing the check, they can keep taking that poison damage even, after you've used the spell. It's a really good spell. honestly. And if you find an enemy that has a very poor fortitude saving throw, this is a really good way to keep some damage on them. And as you level up, the DC for them to pass the check gets higher and higher. So even though it's a level 1 spell, you're going to be able to very consistently and easily at least do some damage to all enemies. At least enemies that take poison damage, but most enemies take at least the piercing damage that the sting does. So it's a really, really good early level spell, and it's a really good spell that you can use even in later game to poke and prod your enemy's defenses, as I mentioned before. And they have a really good fortitude, you might want to swap things up, and this is just a really good way to go about it. Not only that, but the Abberant Bloodline does have a lot of other good ones. Touch of Idiocy, Vampiric Touch, Confusion, lots of really, really good spells. And the Bloodline spells are going to be really, really good as well. I have it over here on the screen, so that's why I keep looking over here. So yeah, Abberant Bloodline, it's really interesting. It allows you to keep your distance while still using touch spells, which are really good spells inherently. And honestly, I just love the idea of your cloak flaps open and a tentacle, like at lightning speed, strikes a foe and then retracts underneath the cloak. It's a very good thematic build. Anyway, let's go ahead and get to the feats. I'm sorry, this one's taking a lot. It's a really interesting build. All right, so starting out, we're actually going to be taking Dangerous Sorcery. It's a really good one at level 2, especially with Spider Sting being your predominant damaging spell, because Spider Sting doesn't have a duration and deals damage, so you're guaranteed to do a d4 plus 1 damage every time you use the spell. It's really good, but plus 1 damage actually really does help, and it means that you're likely to do 2d4 plus 1 damage as long as the enemy isn't immune to one of your damage types. It's very solid. It's a very consistent spell. Does it do the most damage? No, not really, but it is very consistent and it is almost impossible to miss with the skill. You like always will do at least a d4 plus 1 damage. Very typically. It's very good. Not only that, but whenever you pick up spells later, as long as they're straight damage spells, like when you use Grim Tendrils, it doesn't have a duration, so Grim Tendrils is another good early level spell you can sack it with. I actually do in this build have a list of spells I recommend for each of your spell levels. I don't normally do for spellcasters because that's one, it's a lot, and two, it's usually up to the players on their play style, but for sorcerers, it's kind of just a part of their kit, because they only get such a limited spell list in comparison to something like a wizard, or any of the full list casters like the cleric or the druid. So I did add a good number of spells, we'll get to that after the feats, but Dangerous Sorcery, really good feat to pick up at your early levels. All right, so at level 4, I'm going to recommend Occult Evolution. The evolution spells are all really, or feats are all really, really good. They all do some great things and they open up for better feats later, so I always recommend picking up on Sorcerer. But this one is especially really good because what it does is, one, it gives you access to a skill. I recommend Nature if you haven't already invested in it, because we're going to need it for some of the stuff we're going to be doing a little later in the build, but Nature is a really good one. Any of the intelligence-based ones are really solid if your action during your turn between spell casting is not taken up by like a Metamagic or something. You're going to want to do like a Recall Knowledge, see what your enemies have going on. Nature is going to be really, really good though, and I highly recommend it for this if you don't have it invested already. On top of that, this is a really good one because you can spend a minute each day to add one mental spell that you, at a spell level you can cast to your repertoire. This means that you actually have the ability to be flexible as you need it and to pick the spells that are optimal for what situation you're going to be in. It does have to be one spell that has the mental trait, I believe. It just says choose one mental occult spell. So I believe it has to have the mental trait, but you know, maybe there's some other thing to it. I'm not sure. Either way, it's really good. It's really flexible and you just cost a minute. It's not even like a 10-minute thing. It's a very solid feat overall, and it'll just make your character more expansive on what you can do. At 6th level, we're going to pick up the Advanced Bloodline feat. It's a really solid feat overall. More or less, what it does is it gives you the next Bloodline focus spell, which in this case is going to be Abhorrent Whispers. It's a very good will save based spell or focus spell that you can use. It has 1 to 3 actions. The one action is actually pretty cool. Not many spells, especially in the core release, were capable of being used with a single action. Though, honestly, it's not super good because the one action means that they're within 5 feet of you, which is not good for you personally. But what the good thing about Abhorrent Whispers is as you get higher in level as well, the range in which you can affect grows and grows. It starts off 5 feet per action you put into. So one action is 5-foot emanation, and 3 actions 15 foot. And then every 3 spell levels, so at spell levels 1, 4, 7, and 10, it increases the initial radius. Not a lot, obviously, but it can make it so that eventually you can cover a good portion of most rooms. Honestly, it's very solid. And so what the spell actually does is that they need to make a will save. If they succeed, nothing happens, which is very unfortunate. I really don't like pass or fail kind of checks, but this one does have a very good effect because if they fail the check, they become stupefied 2, which does reduce their will saves, which is going to be very devastating. And it only lasts for 1 round, but that's amazing if they're close to you and you use Abhorrent Whispers, that will drop their essentially their will saves, and then you can use another spell after that to attempt to, disable them or do whatever. So it does have some really good potential. Not only that, but it's all foes, only foes, not all creatures, which is another good effect within that emanation range. On top of that, if they crit fail, they become confused, which is a very, very strong debuff in the game. And it's may not likely to happen, but it does have that chance nonetheless. And when you kind of mix this in with the frightened condition from a good demoralized check, if they're right next to you, you can scare them, then you can use your Abhorrent Whispers, giving you a higher chance of that crit, or at the very least stupefying them, making your next spell on them, hopefully. Well, not your next spell on them, but maybe an ally spell on them really, really good. So Abhorrent Whispers is really worth it, I think, for this feat. At 8th level, we're actually going to dip into an archetype. Now, I will state that this archetype is an uncommon one, so you do need your GM's permission to gain access to it. I don't see a big problem with it because the Ritualist is predominantly based on setting up rituals, which means you have to have time, sometimes gold, and you need a secondary caster, at least at the beginning, to get really the most out of it. So from a DM perspective, it's not really that big a deal, honestly, though there are some really powerful rituals in the game, but it doesn't necessarily give you access to all the rituals. It's still really good regardless. So I recommend the Ritualist because it gives you that cultic feel. You have this knowledge, and occultism is used in a lot of rituals, actually, which is why I recommend boosting occultism as one of your primary skills leveling up. So with it as well, you get access to two uncommon rituals, and are at 8th level, and I think every 4 levels. Let me double check. Yes, correct. Every 4 levels after that, you actually get an additional uncommon ritual that is no more than half your level. So when you pick this up, you can get 3 rituals right out the gate, 2 of which must be uncommon ones that are level 1. Nope, half your level, never mind. So all of these could be level 4 rituals. Now, the rituals I recommend picking up is Elemental Sentinel. It's a really good one. It essentially gives you a free alarm spell, security spell you can use as long as it is successful. It's a very good one overall. There's a lot of good ways this can be used in the game. Not in combat, but, rituals aren't meant for combat anyway. So this is a really good one overall. Another one is Mystic Carriage. Mystic Carriage is really good for long distance travel, and it's a really solid way to get where you need to go with very little issue. And in fact, it's so good, that unless something completely can destroy the carriage in the few turns that a creature might have access to it, you can get pretty safely from place to place as long as there's a viable route to do so. And last but not least, it's really up to you. Geas is a really good one for roleplay reasons. You can make an enemy kind of swear a vow to not go against you, for instance, and kind of get a secure way of doing it. Geas is a really good ritual to have in general. And, it's up to you. Whatever the rituals are, it's for your flavor and what you think might be helpful. And not only that, but as more books come out, more rituals may become available, meaning that this build might have some different options a little later, depending on when you watch this video. All right, at level 10, yes, 10, this is going to be the Greater Bloodline. This is going to be where you're going to pick up your next Bloodline focus spell. This one is going to be Unusual Anatomy. It's a really good one. It's a single action that only has somatic components, so you can even do this kind of stealthily if no one's watching you. And you can set yourself up. You gain a 10 resistance to precision damage and resistance 10 to extra damage from criticals. So whatever the double damage is, so you take all the normal damage, but if whatever of the extra damage, the doubled part, if it's 10 or less, you essentially get rid of it. If you have any remaining like damage reduction, it doesn't go back to the initial hit, unfortunately, but it does make you more tanky, honestly. There's a good amount of enemies that actually do good precision damage, so this is very solid. And reducing criticals does increase your character's overall survivability as well. Not only that, but your skin oozes with acid, making any enemy that hits you with an unarmed attack or with a non-reach melee weapon take 2d6 acid damage, and then every odd level after spell level 5, so 7 and 9, you increase that by an additional d6, and your resistance go up by 5. So overall, pretty good. It's a good buff. No concentration, or at least like no sustaining of it. Really pairs well. You can take this with the tentacular limbs to make it where you just have a good buff round where your character just turns into a monster, which I think is really cool, honestly, and it's something that can be done very thematically in a lot of ways. I thoroughly enjoy the Abberant Bloodline, if you can't tell. 12th level was a bit of a hard one for me to pick on there's a lot of good feats in Sorcerer, and obviously I could pick up more ritualistic feats, but I actually took blood components. One of the major reasons is that a large part of your kit are going to be mental spells that can affect enemies or targets. They're not necessarily enemies. And the blood component substitution feat, or not substitution, it's substitution, allows you to substitute either a somatic, verbal, or material component with taking twice the spell level in damage to yourself. So as long as an ally is appropriately distracting a foe, you could feeble mind dominate anyone in a setting where it's just you and the target, not a lot of people can see you, because you do glow with the color of your blood, which is really great as well, because then you can very thematically, like whatever the color of blood your character has, set up the aesthetic for this particular feat. It's a really good one overall, and it has a lot of good uses, especially if you're trying to initiate a combat, but you're still like parlaying with your foes or anything like that, or a lot of good roleplay moments there. You're trying to get something, and you can use this to very strong, like a good player can make blood component substitution fit very, very well. And it's a really good one, I think, for this build as well. At 14th level, we're going to be taking Flexible Ritualist. It's a really good one. It allows you to essentially reduce the number of secondary casters by 1, allowing you to cast some rituals completely by yourself, which is really solid overall. And you do have to make the checks of the second one, so you got to make sure that you're at least good enough in the secondary skills. That's why I recommended Nature earlier. It should probably be Expert at this level, if not higher. And it's just really solid overall, and it makes your character capable of spending, a day doing something themselves, doing something while other characters are crafting, shopping, doing whatever. And it has that, again, that cultist kind of like, oh yeah, I'm just going to go, sacrifice the heart of a lamb in the back alley. Don't worry, guys, I'll be back in a day. It's really good. At 16th level, there were just too many options for me to make a solid guess. So this is a free space where you can pick any feat that you find is very appropriate for you, whether it's more ritualist feats, or, in my recommendation, I recommend the Greater Mental Evolution. The Greater Mental Evolution allows you to add an additional spell to your repertoire per spell level that you have access to. This gives you more options for your spells that you can cast, obviously, and it's a really good one overall, giving you more options. But if you're not necessarily concerned about what spells you have access to, obviously Ritualist is another good way to go. You can pick up one of the many good Ritualist feats. At 18th level, I picked up Echoing Spell, which is a very solid one, especially because of one of the major spells I feel in this build overall is going to be the Fear spell. And so what Echoing Spell does is it's a metamagic. You use an action and then you cast a spell. In this case, I'd recommend like the 3rd level Fear spell. And what it does is that on your next turn, before the end of your next turn anyway, you can cast the spell again at no extra expenditure of your spell slots. It's very solid, and the Fear spell especially is really good. 3rd level Fear is solid because what it does is it can fear 5 creatures, and so you can fear a total of 10 creatures. Late game encounters, this is really good. Your save should be pretty solid for most enemies. This is also a good way to do a litmus test on a lot of enemies in a fight to see if they have really high resistances to will, for instance. So there's a lot of good ways that this can really be done. And Fear is also really good. The Fear spell, even if they succeed, they become Frightened 1, and if they fail, they become Frightened 2. And I believe if they crit fail, they become Frightened 3 and Fleeing for 1 round, which is also pretty nutty. So it's a very solid spell to use it with, and Echoing Spell also has a lot of good use with other spells. It's a good meta magic to pick up to kind of do some extra things to set up a lot of debuffs, or a lot of buffs maybe in the early rounds as well, depending, because I think also haste, if you have access to it with the Occult spells, which I'm not sure at this moment, but you could do multiple hastes on multiple people for free slots. Granted, higher level hastes obviously might be better, but maybe your higher level slots are already dedicated to something else. Who knows? Either way, it's a very good meta magic, and I highly recommend it. Level 20 was another slot that I just really couldn't pick a particular one that I felt overly fit the bill. More or less, these free spaces are that there was just no feat I felt fit better, so there's just a lot of options. I recommend the Metamagic Mastery. It allows you to use Echoing Spell essentially as a free action rather than an action, allowing you to demoralize, then use whatever spell you are, like Fear, which is really solid overall. And obviously, during your adventures, you may pick up other metamagics, or you might have access to like the free archetype bonus feature of the game. You might be playing with that, in which case your Ritualist might be taken up with that, so you might have some more metamagics, or your DM may have given you one as rewards for certain character arcs. Either way, I think it's a really solid one. Being able to use Echoing Spell as a free metamagic as well is essentially super solid. So I just really recommend it, but there's so many good options, and again, picking up more Ritualist feats, especially if you're playing more standard play, that I think is really good. So that's my recommendation overall. And I know this video has been dragging on a little bit, but I do want to go over the spells because I think having a good list of spells is important as far as what this playstyle is about, because the spells I picked were specifically Fortitude and Will saving throws. So the enemy is going to obviously be really good at one or the other, but never both. It's very rare that an enemy has a very good fort save and doesn't have a really bad will save. Even if it's their like middle ground, their average save or whatever, it still will be pretty easy for you to affect. So most of these spells are targeted towards one or the other, and they also take into consideration the aberrant spells that you get from your bloodline that are automatically added to your repertoire. So starting out is going to be Fear and Grim Tendrils from your first level spell slots. In addition to Spider Sting, this gives you a lot of good options for what you can do. Spider Sting does very solid damage early game, can enfeeble enemies. Grim Tendrils is really good, does negative damage, which affects almost all living creatures. And it has the chance of you doing persistent bleed damage, which is very nasty. And Fear is good because, honestly, when you fear a target, it helps your entire team and yourself. So the higher you can, hit them with the Fear, the better. I also recommend taking Fear as your signature spell for this level because casting it at the 3rd level is just very solid. You can hit almost an entire room or a good number of them just from that alone. And obviously as well, Spider Sting you can use with your tentacular limbs to do some very consistent damage. Very good. Cantrips I didn't mention in this build, by the way. I should mention. You get Daze automatically for just being apparent. It's important, but I think it's mostly just pick something that does damage, pick something that has good utility. You're good to go no matter what, and you get 4, I think, or 5. So, or I think it's 4, and then Days is your 5th or whatever. It's very good either way, but whatever cantrips you pick, I think will be good as long as you have one really good, solid, damaging one. And Days works perfectly because if you're fearing enemies or affecting or giving them stupefy, whatever, it's going to do just more damage more likely. So it's very solid overall. At 2nd level, I recommend picking up Blood Vendetta and making it your signature spell. It's a really good reaction spell, does damage, does persistent bleed damage, very good overall. And it's just one of those ones that honestly is always going to be useful because you're not a class that uses reactions a lot, and your 2nd level spell slots are not going to be like overly helpful in the later game anyway, so it's really good. I also recommend taking Darkness, especially because if you get the ability to see through darkness, it just gives you nothing but good benefits, and it's a good way to escape from certain situations. And Paranoia, because Paranoia can break up enemy groups and make some enemies just be non-combative or start attacking their allies. Very solid overall, and it's another one of those mental affecting spells. This one also has Touch of Idiocy, which is pretty devastating because it does if they fail it, it's a 2 stupefied, and if it is a crit fail, it's a 4 stupefied. 4 stupefied would be devastating for some enemies, and if they're already weak mentally, you're just going to utterly break them with some of your spells. It's really good for this spell list overall. Not a lot of 4/2 ones, Blood Vendetta is one, but a lot of good either visual or just will-based ones. This is and obviously with all my spell levels as well, I did leave more slots available for you to pick, especially with greater mental evolution. So you're going to have more options to do whatever playstyle you feel fit. I'm just picking some good ones from each level that fit thematically and also attack their body and mind. 3rd level, you're going to pick up Agonizing Despair, which is going to be one of your bread and butter spells. It's really good. It does really good, I believe, mental damage or negative damage, and it frightens foes as well. It's essentially a better fear spell that does damage, and I recommend making it your signature spell because even as you level it up, it just becomes really good. It's a very good go-to spell for a lot of cases if the enemy is obviously capable of suffering from it. If an enemy is mindless, I don't think they'd take anything from Agonizing Despair, but most enemies are not mindless, so there's going to be overall a really good one. I'm also going to recommend Moth's Supper. It's a very fun one because it has that cultic vibe. Came from Dark Archives. Very solid Moth's Supper. You spew moths out of your mouth, and then for a minute you get some good benefits. Oh, I'm sorry, 1 hour. And every 10 minutes you recover 2d4 hit points, which is pretty solid. And I'm guessing that must be when you use it initially. So you use it, you get immediately 2d4 hit points, and then every 10 minutes after that, you get some more. And whenever someone successfully uses Treat Wounds on you, you regain an additional 4d4 hit points, and you gain an imprecise sense of 30 feet that sense only freshly spilled blood or rotten flesh. And then as you heighten it, it also increases the amount you're healed every 10 minutes and the amount you're healed from treat wounds. This is just a really solid one to pick up as kind of like one slot you just need to have active, and it can recover you from a fight almost completely. It's just very solid overall. It's one I really like, and it fits the aesthetic perfectly. 4th level spells, I recommend Blood Spray Curse, a very solid one. Overall allows you to make enemies take more damage from slashing and piercing damage. Very solid. And Phantasmal Killer. Again, another spell that I highly recommend making your signature spell. It just does really good, solid damage as it levels up, and it's just a very good spell overall. 5th level, I recommend Blister and making it your signature spell for the level. It's very solid for damaging cones of enemies. It's just got that you curse them, big blobs appear on them. It's very gross, very grody, very eldritch, and then you can just snap your fingers and it explodes, dealing a bunch of damage to a bunch of people. I think it's really cool, if not very gross, and it fits the build perfectly. And then on top of that, strange geometry. Again, you drive people insane by giving them visions of things that do not make sense in our liminal space. So it's a very good setup and very thematic. 6th level, I'm going to recommend Phantasmal Calamity, a very good, strong, will-based save spell. Does a lot of good damage, and on top of that, I'm also going to recommend Repulsion. It's actually a really good spell for keeping you alive. It makes enemies a lot harder to approach you directly, and it can be something that can save your life. And then speaking of, I'm also going to recommend Vampiric Exsanguination, which is just a better version of Vampiric Touch, which you actually do get as one of your Bloodline spells at an earlier level as well. And I think both of these actually, one second. No. Vampiric Exsanguination is a cone, but you can use Vampiric Touch with your tentacular limbs, which is very solid as well, giving you a good amount of health back and dealing good negative damage as well as being our fortitude-based spells for this spell level. At 7th level, the first spell I'm going to recommend is going to be one that's from one of the adventure paths. You can find it on Archive of Nethys, and it's going to be up to your DM whether they let you have it. Again, it's not a very overly powerful spell, but it is unique, I guess, to that adventure path, whatever. It's going to be Lang's Spider Sting, or Lang Sting, right? What is it? I have it written here. Lang Sting. It allows you to do... It's a better version of Spider Sting. It's a very high level one. I think it also does mental damage. One second. No, it's just a better version of Spider Sting. It automatically will do 2d6 piercing damage when you touch the creature, so it guarantees 2d6 damage, and you're likely to do 4d6 damage with it, which is not a lot for a 7th level spell, I agree. But the Lang Spider Venom is very powerful, as if they fail the check, not only will they take an additional 2d6 poison damage, but they'll take another 2d6 poison damage and become drained 1, making their fortitude saves weaker, which is going to be very good, especially because they have to make more fortitude saves to get rid of the poison, which will do more poison damage and make them higher levels of drained. And eventually they become confused, and this can completely debilitate enemies. Not only that, tentacular limbs. At this level, you're going to be hitting people from pretty far away with your stings, so I think it's a really good spell overall for the level. Beyond that, Mask of Terror is a really good one. It makes it... I really love it because what it does is when an enemy sees you, they see their most horrid fear in you. And no one sees the same thing twice. So this has that idea that any targets who are not directly affected by it are looking at you and they don't know why anyone is afraid of you or whoever you place the mask on. And it's really cool Eldritch vibes. It can prevent enemies from striking you or make enemies frightened before they strike you, or an ally, which is good because this spell also can be used with your allies as well to give them some defenses in some situations. It can also be really good on your front line if there's no one else around, because then the enemy might have to waste an action because they weren't able to attack them. Mask of Terror is just a very solid spell overall. And last but not least, Tempest of Shades. It's a really good one. You send a bunch of ghosts to essentially suck the life out of people. It's going to be our fort save for this level if we don't get Lang Sting. And overall, it's a really good spell. Spirit Song is going to be my recommended one, and the one I'm going to recommend as our signature spell from this one. Not that it does all too much, but it does increase its damage. And Spirit Song is really good because it's a basic fortitude saving throw for a lot of damage. It does 18d6 force damage, everyone in a 60-foot cone, and it has enough and it also affects spirits. So anything that has a spirit is affected, including things like creatures are astrally projecting, for instance, or spirits that are possessing people or located in objects. There's a lot of good uses for this, especially in the end game. And it's 18d6. Even if it's a basic fort save, it's a lot of damage. Because that's, 9d6 damage? If they pass? That's a lot. And it can affect most things as long as they have what's considered a spirit. So, very good. And our will save for this one is going to be based on Spiritual Epidemic, which is another really good spell. It's a will saving throw, and not only that, but it's contagious. I love contagion-based spells. And so what happens is they make a will save, and if they succeed the check, they're enfeebled 2 and stupefied 2 for a round. That's pretty devastating for just succeeding. If they fail, they're Enfeebled 2 and Stupefied 2 for a minute, and Enfeebled 1 and Stupefied 1 permanently. None of the permanently really means too much because most enemies you're using this on, I'm assuming you're going to try to kill. But hey, if they use an annoying dimension door to get away, they're still kind of messed up. And if they crit fail, Stupefied and Enfeebled 3 for 1 minute, and Enfeebled 2 and Stupefied 2 permanently. Nuts. But even better, any creature that casts a divine or occult spell on the target while it's affected by the spiritual epidemic must also attempt a will save, or the curse continues to spread, or the curse spreads to them. So if you have an enemy that is using, healers of some kind, you can actually bounce this to a few creatures. And I think that's kind of nuts. And there's going to be some situations, especially endgame, that this could be very helpful with, especially because healing with enemies becomes a lot more frequent. So this is going to be a very good one overall and a very fun spell. At 9th level, I'm going to recommend Voracious Gestalt. You essentially create a consciousness that goes around trying to consume the consciousness of others. It's a very devastating spell, and it's just, again, very thematic. And then Unspeakable Shadow will be our will save based one for this one. And it's also another completely devastating spell. And for our 10th level spell, the Gate spell, allowing you to traverse the planes. And it seems appropriate for this one as you are connected to the outer planes. Overall, the spells are just my recommendations for what you should pick to kind of give your character the ability to focus on the enemy's body and mind has been a big theme. And not only that, I felt were thematically appropriate for what this, build is about. Whatever spells you pick will probably be good. It doesn't really matter. This build doesn't have a lot of setup for these other than the high intimidation for reducing will saves, but it's a very interesting and thematic way to play the game. And this is a very strong build because, again, no matter what the enemy has, you're going to have their weakness somewhere in your back pocket, and you can test a lot of enemies with some of the features in this build as well. If you're using the free archetype bonus rule, which I highly recommend most people do, obviously finishing out Ritualist or getting a lot more of the Ritualist feats is something I'd recommend, but I'm also going to recommend picking up the Eldritch Researcher, as that is a very solid one overall and one of my favorite archetypes in the game. As well as Living Vessel makes utter sense for this, very much fits the build. And honestly, if it was not a rare archetype, I would have just made a part of the build. But because it is rare and because it is a bit of a burden on the DM with some of the aspects of Living Vessel, I couldn't include it in the build in good conscience because it just might not be viable for most tables. But if you do have access to it, Living Vessel is absolutely perfect for this build because you can literally house an Eldritch entity in your body, and I think that is utterly cool. And the last one was kind of a hard one to pick between the archetypes. Exorcist, I think, was good. Your character knows something about the supernatural and those that exist on planes beyond. So it's something that you can do to kind of add a little bit more viability in some situations or to add a little bit more uniqueness. Whatever you pick is really good. Exorcist was just honestly the only one I could pick that kind of fit the build as far as archetypes are concerned. As far as the Ancestries go, and we're almost done, so thank you all so much for watching the video up until this point. I highly appreciate you all. Just a few more things and we're done here. Ancestries I recommend. Human for the flavor. Human is good in general, but human with versatile heritage gives you the ability to essentially create that person who has been affected by some outer source, and then whatever Eldritch entity aberration can be skinned in a lot of different ways. Even if you go with one of the elemental, like the Oread, the Ifrits, the Sylph, or whatever, it can be a Eldritch entity that also has elemental properties. Whatever it is, you can change your character physically with that versatile heritage, and technically you could do this for any of the core normal common races as well and get much the same effect. Human is just the one I recommend because they have a lot of good feats, obviously, but also it just I like the idea of doing this because you can you can set it up where your character is physically changed by whatever is happening to them for the narrative. It's really, really good. Another good one that I found, though, and one that I was not really expecting, was actually the Tengu, and in this case, the Dogtooth Tengu. And the reason why I recommend Tengu specifically is, one, they're bird people. They already kind of have that macabre kind of the crow aesthetic, which I think very much fits with the Eldritch themes. On top of that, the Dogtooth Tengu has a beak attack that has, I believe, Backstabber or some extra effect to it. And because Tentacular Limbs allows you to make unarmed strikes at that extended range of 10 feet, even though you're not good at it, you can still do it. And what's worse is it's a beak attack, so your beak extends and can stab people, which is horrifying, and I love it. It's really good. It's really solid overall. Not only that, but the Tengu can really set themselves up with some of their feats to do things like consume misfortune, which is very weird, very out there. I might even make the Maelstrom or the Curse Maelstrom archetype dedication really fit with your build, especially because that one's all about, consuming misfortune and being possessed by it. So there's a lot of really good ways that Tengu can actually be used with your Eldritch Touch Sorcerer. And that's going to be the build. I hope you all enjoyed it. If you have any comments, leave them down below on if you liked the build or maybe some alterations you would make to it. I'm really proud of this one. It was a harder build to make. I thought the concept was good, but I felt like actually mechanically going through with it was a lot harder than I expected, and it came mostly from spell selection rather than actual character feat selection. So there might be a lot of ways to do this, but I still think this is a very viable build. It's really good. There's not going to be many situations where you're going to be completely unable to do anything, and even then you still have what you have available at just being a sorcerer, and you have the flexibility with your spells to do pretty much anything you really want, and sorcerers are really strong. So this is going to be it for me. Thank you all so much for watching, and I hope you enjoyed. Good luck with your games. Leave the bad luck to me, and I'll see you all next time. Bye.